Hey guys! Alright, so my last video I talked about what Congress does. If you watched that, then you hopefully have this sort of firm foundation of the legislative branch, what the legislative branch is supposed to do, why it exists. It exists to make law, right? The law is there to protect us and our private property from each other. And so Congress is really important. It's the most important branch because it's the one branch that actually makes law. I mean, government really doesn't exist if there is no law, right? The executive wouldn't and the judicial wouldn't. And so I think this is something that a lot of people don't actually think through or take to the end. But if you really process it, without the legislative branch, there's no government. Also, the legislative branch is most connected to us because we want to be the ones directly influencing the laws that we have to follow, right? It's pretty important. That's a huge part of liberal philosophy. Okay, so with that as the backdrop, what I want to do today is I want to focus on what the Constitution lays out that Congress can make laws about, all right? And that's a big deal. So the Constitution acts as sort of a guide for our government, right? It's limiting the power of government. It protects us from government by stipulating to government exactly what government can do, which means that if it's not on the list of the things it can do, that it can't do it, right? So it needs to be in the list. If they make a law, it needs to be because the Constitution says that it can make a law about this particular issue. If you watch one of my videos in the past, I talk about something called arbitrary power, which is basically this idea that power comes from nowhere. And that's really important to think about because if power comes from nowhere, if it's derived from nothing, then it's limitless. You can't argue against someone's power if the power is coming from nowhere. And so that's the important aspect that the Constitution provides. It provides a limit, a boundary to the power that government has. And so essentially the Constitution is sort of protecting us and our private property from government, while government exists to protect us and our private property from each other, right? So that's why the Constitution is so important. And it's really important to know what the Constitution says Congress can make laws about, because everything else is going to fall on that. It's going to come from that, right? Because if the executive is executing laws that are unconstitutional, it's because Congress first made those laws that are unconstitutional, right? So these are really important things that I want people to think about as I go through this list of powers. But before we ever get into all of that, I just want you to sort of let the basic powers sink in for what Congress can or cannot make laws about. One final point I want to say before I jump into this, that understand that the founders, when they were making the Constitution, they were concerned about the chaos and anarchy that was happening at the state level prior to the Constitution. So the Articles of Confederation weren't working out so well. The states there's a lot of chaos, right? There was not a universal currency. There wasn't a universal way to declare war. There wasn't a universal way to have taxation. And things were just messy. So there were a lot of sort of chaotic things that were happening that was mounting and mounting and mounting. And there was this fear that if there wasn't some sort of stronger centralized source of power that could sort of handle all of this chaos and bring sort of some order to it, that the country would end up just sort of failing and going into utter chaos, and then that would lead to tyranny, et cetera, et cetera. So the founders wanted to avoid that. And they thought, well, we're going to leave almost all the powers to the states. So don't worry about that. But we do need to take a couple powers and let that be handled at a federal level. Okay? So a lot of what I list here of the powers that Congress has are very logical conclusions to come to if you want to bring some order to an otherwise chaotic situation with multiple different various governments. All right. So let's start out. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. Now I've got my list of powers here, so I'm going to be looking down because I do not have these memorized. Okay, so in case you were wondering whether or not the legislative or lawmaking powers in Congress, I'd like for you guys to see my American flag, patriotic, so I'm going to turn that on there. All right. So all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. In case you were wondering if the lawmaking powers are vested in one particular branch, being the legislative branch, this is what the Constitution actually says. All legislative powers. Can't get much more clear than that. Okay, power number one. Congress can make laws about taxation. The power to lay and collect taxes. Pretty simple. They didn't want all the states having their own versions of taxation, and the federal government have no money whatsoever, and therefore really no way to operate. So they needed to sort of centralize this power. Borrow money on credit. Again, it's a little chaotic to have multiple different states borrowing money from multiple different countries, and it just gets a little out of hand. So let's let that be a federal power. Makes sense. Regulate commerce with foreign nations and among states. Again, difficult to have commerce among states, or, from one state to one country, from another state to another country, all of that going on, different trade rules and regulations per state, amongst states. It just gets really out of control. So let's centralize this and make sure that if it's going to be across state borders, or if it's going to be between the country and another country, this should probably be handled by the federal government. That's really it. Now, the Commerce Clause has been taken to mean a lot more than that. And probably, I would say, 60% of a lot of the unconstitutional powers and laws that are passed by Congress now are justified by this Commerce Clause, okay? And the Supreme Court has a lot to do with this. So I could spend some time going over that in another video, but for now, just think of it from the founders' perspective. This is not here, let me give you a ton of power, Congress. This is we just need to sort of make sure that we have some order here. So therefore, Congress should be able to sort of regulate these across state borders commerce that's happening. Okay. Establish uniform rules of naturalization. Now, this is really important as well. So basically, Congress has the power to make law about any form of immigration. So if you're coming from another country and you want to become an American citizen, that needs to be a federal issue, a federal law. It's going to be difficult if you're coming and you're trying to be a citizen of the US, but you're a citizen of New York, and New York has different standards than North Carolina. North Carolina has different standards than Arizona, and it just gets out of hand. You get where I'm going here? Don't take this so far out of context. If you think of it in context, these powers are not massive powers, but they make sense, especially for what we want a federal government to do, right? The founders didn't want them to have a ton of power. That was definitely something they wanted to avoid. They wanted to avoid tyranny, but they wanted them to have enough power to maintain order. Okay, to coin money, regulate the value thereof. Again, imagine trying to have multiple different currencies across different states. It just wouldn't work. So that needs to be a national thing. So Congress can make a law about that. Punish counterfeiting. Since it is Congress that's the one that is coining the money, it makes sense that that's a federal crime rather than a state crime. Establish post offices and roads. Again, how difficult would it be if one state had their own postal service that was different than another state's postal service, and you were trying to send mail from one state to another, but it was all jumbled and different? That's not going to work, okay? That needs to be a federal issue. More or less promote progress in science and arts by allowing for patents and copyrights and all of those things. That needs to be federal, and it's incredibly important that our federal government protect our rights to the things we create, right? If the whole point of government is to protect private property, then what better way to do it than to protect something that you create? And it really promotes innovation. It promotes sort of this unique thing that we've seen in the United States, where the progress that we've come as human beings has been exponential since the United States allowed for this sort of innovation. So this is a really important federal power. It would not work so well at a state level, because if you wrote a book, for instance, and that book was protected by a state, well, what happens if your book is sold in another state? Can somebody else say it's their book and there's no law to protect it if it's a different law? No, this needs to be universal. It needs to be a federal law. Okay. So constitute tribunals to the Superior Court. That sounds really big and complicated. It's not. So Congress creates our courts. It's as simple as that. The only court that's created by the Constitution is the Supreme Court. That's it. So any other court that we have that's not a state court, but is a federal level court, so appellate courts, circuit courts, things like that, those are created by Congress. That's pretty much what it says. Congress can write laws to make these courts. Define and punish piracies. Well, that also makes sense. It would be difficult to deal with crimes on seas, because one state might say this was in my waters and the other might say this was in my waters, and they have different interpretations of the law, and it just gets a little messy. Let's just go ahead and say that's a federal crime. Declare war. Again, we don't want South Carolina declaring war on Russia while the rest of the country or the states are not interested in going to war with Russia, right? That should be something that's handled at the federal level, specifically the legislative branch. Now what we find is that the executive branch is declaring all of our wars. He's not even declaring the wars. He's essentially just sort of engaging in military conflict against the Constitution. The point of the Constitution is that we want to be involved in this decision-making process. We the people, right? And the legislative branch is the branch connected to us. If we're going to go fight and die in a war, well, we want to have a vested interest in this war, and we have to really feel justified in going to war with this country. So we want it to be the legislative branch that makes that decision. At the time, it was probably because the founders wanted to avoid states doing that. But today, what I think is more relevant is that it's the legislative branch, not the executive branch. Okay. To raise and support armies, to provide and maintain the Navy, and to provide for the calling forth of the militia. So essentially, it's the legislative branch that raises, meaning they literally write law to create armies and navies, and now we have air force as well. So they didn't know airplanes existed when America was founded, so it makes sense that they didn't create or put that in the Constitution. But it goes without saying that any form of military to protect the country is going to be kind of created by Congress in the first place. And then not only is it created / raised, it's actually supported, meaning the funding comes from Congress, right? And this is important because it's not the executive, one person, who makes this decision. Yeah, he commands them, but he doesn't have the power to fund them or to create them. That's left to the people, right? We, the people who create and are represented by Congress, want to have a sort of a bigger say in something like the armies that are going to defend us. The militia is a little bit more of a area that's murky. Back in that day, there were state militias. Also, the founders were pretty clear that they considered almost any citizen part of the militia. More or less, they thought that all the citizenry should be armed and that the citizenry should be a big part of the enforcement of the law. They relied on the citizenry to do that. So if the federal government needed to call up the militia for whatever reason, they should and could do that, but it had to be Congress. Today, we don't have militia per se. You could say that maybe just the armed citizenry would be part of the militia. The National Guard might be part of the militia, because the Constitution goes on to say to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. And so the federal government / the legislative branch, Congress, has the legal ability to call forth the citizenry and train them should a crisis occur. I'm curious to see what this would look like if there were ever a crisis that the U.S. Congress felt compelled to call the armed citizenry to defend the country for some reason. I don't ever see that really actually materializing, but nevertheless, Congress has the ability to make laws that have to do with that. One little note before the final kind of power is to exercise legislation over all places purchased by government. That sounds weird and complicated, but it's not. Basically, it means Congress can make laws that direct how things are handled on government property, specifically Washington, D.C. So the final and most important little part of these enumerated powers is this last sentence. Now it says, I'm going to read it, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution and the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Okay, so let's think about this. This has been taken way out of context, right? We now hear the necessary and proper clause being used all the time. Well, is it necessary and proper? It's necessary and proper to write this law, or it's necessary and proper to do this and that. No, the language is pretty simple. Again, this is not rocket science. All right, so Congress has the ability to what? To make all laws, so simple word there, all laws, which shall be necessary and proper. Okay, so any law that's necessary and proper to do what? To carry into execution the foregoing powers. Okay, so in other words, everything I just listed, these are powers. They're not laws. They're the specific powers that Congress can make law about. Nothing beyond that. Anything beyond that is left to the states. That was the point. They created Congress to sort of bring some order to an otherwise chaotic situation. These were the ways that they felt Congress could do that. Anything beyond that, they felt would be tyrannical power, too much power for the federal government. So they're going to leave all that power to the states, but we're going to let Congress make laws about these specific things. So anything necessary and proper to execute these powers, any laws they need to make to execute these powers, they can do that. That's where their power lies. That's really it. It's not this sort of big, broad stroke justification to make a law about anything that somebody deems necessary and proper for something. That's a little absurd. So what I want you to do is I want you to think through everything I just stepped through. Process it for yourself, right? Maybe go read the Constitution yourself. Watch this video again. Do a little research. And then I want you to think about what Congress makes the laws about today. Think about what you want Congress to make laws about today, okay? Think it through. And I want you to think about whether or not Americans are really looking at Congress as this sort of limited power up there that does what they're supposed to do based on the Constitution, or if we think of government as far more powerful than what the Constitution ever intended for it to be, right? And understand, there's a cost to demanding government to do more than what is listed in this list. There's a cost to that. Because if the government, which it does, so I don't want to pretend like that it doesn't, of course it does. That's the whole point of what I'm trying to do here, is to sort of shine a light on the unconstitutionality of what our government's doing now. But you got to know what it actually says if you're going to actually be able to realize what it's doing. So anything outside of this list of powers is arbitrary, okay? So even if you think there's some really good thing the government can do, whatever that might be, even if you think it's great, if it's outside of these powers, you have to realize that there is therefore now no limitation to what Congress can do. Because you can't pull the Constitution in for something else that you disagree with if you won't pull it in to stop something you agree with, right? And that means it can go as far as it wants. Congress can go as far as it wants with however many laws it wants. So just to leave you with a couple things to think about. Where does it say in this list of powers that Congress can make laws about healthcare? What about welfare or education or marriage or social security or the environment, right? Consider that. Short answer for that is there's nowhere in the Constitution that gives Congress the power to make laws about any of these things. And yet we sort of demand it, which is part of the problem. This is why we should be educated and educated citizenry. Now, states can make laws about these things. The federal government was never intended to do that. That was not the point of the federal government. You can't say, oh, you can't make a law to limit my free speech because of the Constitution, if you won't say you can't make a law to provide welfare for citizens because of the Constitution. You can't pull the Constitution out one point and not in the other. It doesn't work like that. Congress either follows it or it doesn't. It's that simple. So I will let you guys think about this, sort of mull it over, and then I'll bring you some more new information in my next video. Bye.